Okay, kids, it's time for a real Racer X Exhaust podcast by me, Jason Weigandt. You might have been suckered into listening to our 7-minute intro podcast last week, but we actually only did that to trick iTunes algorithm to load us into iTunes, so this real episode would be readily available the moment we post it. Tim Cook, you got suckered, and anyone else listening to this, yeah, you did too. Now, this is a real show. Davey Coombs and I sat down on Friday night before this year's Monster Energy Daytona Supercross to talk about the twisted and tangled history of that event. It actually started as part of the Florida Winter Am Series, which you might not have even heard of. Then it was quickly part of the fledgling brand new AMA National Motocross Championship. Then it somehow switched to Supercross before the term Supercross was even invented. But we'll even explain to you who invented the term Supercross and when and why that happened. That's basically what does happen when you talk to Davey Coombs. In fact, our conversation was so good that Eli Tomac's mom came out of the motorhome after we recorded it and said, "Oh my God, that conversation you had, we were listening to it through the window. I wish you would record this stuff. You should write books. That's really good." And then I said, "Kathy, don't worry. We actually did just record that." So you'll enjoy this trip from the early 1970s all the way through now with myself and Davey. And yes, at the time we didn't know Justin Brayton would win the race, but we did theorize how sometimes these very unique events and unique tracks do lead to unique winners. And we ran through some of those as well. And this is all brought to you by Yoshimura, the leader in four-stroke performance for over 63 years. With unsurpassed quality, service, and development, Yoshimura is the brand you want for your dirt bike, ATV, or street exhaust. Check them out. It's Yoshimura-RD.com. Yes, Yoshimura R&D. The pipe's so nice, Honda puts them on their bikes twice. And a special shout-out to Big E over there, who was all aboard with the idea of turning exhaust into a podcast. So this is for him, and this is for you. But first, the greatest podcast theme song in the history of podcast, a song about podcast that only has one lyric, the word podcast. Let's do it. Podcast. 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 Yes, that's right. This is a Racer X podcast right here in the heart of it all. This is the World Center of Racing. It actually says that. We're not in some recording studio. We are in the infield of Daytona International Speedway. This is our first real edition of the Racer X Exhaust podcast. Big thanks to the folks from Yoshimura. 43 years of innovation on the exhaust front. The pipe's so nice, Honda puts them on their bikes twice. Good thanks to them for sponsoring this. Jason Weigandt and Davey Coombs were at Daytona. Nice hospitality here from our buddy Hilton Beatty of Thor and Parts Unlimited.
Indeed, and we're sitting right outside and right in between Eli Tomac's motorhome, and next to us Eli's, I just saw him throwing horseshoes. I was going to go over and take a photo, but I didn't want to attract the crowd. He looks like he's just relaxing, having fun, and just some guy in a monster hat throwing horseshoes. It
is funny because there's an amateur race here. It's all just mixed in. There's a bunch of motorhomes for kids riding on Sunday and Monday, and then there's just Eli Tomac over there in the mix hanging out like anybody else.
Yeah, this is a very unique Supercross race, probably the most unique of all. Not just the way the facility is, but the way the whole event works, the cadence of it, the atmosphere, and certainly the camaraderie. And I'm working on a feature for the magazine that this is everybody's backyard race. Everyone lives in Florida now.
It's true. Actually, there's one guy that doesn't.
Eli.
Him. Yeah, and he's been the best lately.
That's why he's throwing horseshoes next door.
He's been the best lately. Our goal here on this first real podcast, forget that dumb 7-minute intro I did. That was really just to trick the iTunes algorithm into posting our show. That was just a trick. Sorry, Apple, and what's the guy that runs that now? Tim Cook? Sorry, that was just a trick. This is our first real show, and Davey and I are going to run through the very complicated history of this event because the Daytona Supercross predates Supercross and motocross in many ways.
It predates the word Supercross, the series Supercross. It even predates the AMA Motocross series by a year. And, We give a lot of credit to Mike Goodwin as the godfather of Supercross. But that thing that happened in the Los Angeles Coliseum on July 8th, 1972 was about 17 months after the first Daytona Supercross.
Yeah, because when you come here, that's one of the things I like about this the most. The Daytona 500 is a crown jewel of any kind of racing. But they have Ricky Carmichael's photo up on that tunnel when you drive in. If you win even the 250 class here, it is treated the same, whether you win the Rolex 24-hour race or the Daytona 500 or the July NASCAR race. They treat the champions at Daytona the same. And I always thought, wow, that's really cool that they've come to recognize Supercross as an equal. But actually, it's not the way it worked. They recognized it before most people did. Daytona didn't discover it. It discovered Daytona.
Yeah. That's true. What's funny is I was just in the media center where they have the shakedown of the drivers.
Yeah.
And there's a picture on the wall of Bill France, Sr. There's a picture on the wall of Dale Earnhardt.
Yeah.
And there's a picture on the wall of Ricky Carmichael, 2003, riding a Honda CR250 on his way to the Daytona Supercross win. Right there with the, I guess you'd say, the giants of this place.
Yeah. Okay, so how then does this come about? We know where the Daytona Supercross is now. But how did it actually start? 1971, you're saying. How did this is kind of a weird place to decide to hold a dirt bike race.
Well, it is. And it didn't come without some controversy and some pushback. If you go back to the late 60s, Daytona Bike Week and the Daytona 200 were a very, very big deal.
Yes.
The 200 was the biggest motorcycle race in the United States by far. And it actually started on Daytona Beach. And it wasn't until they built the Speedway in the 50s that they moved it over here, and it became a different kind of race.
Yeah.
If you look at the old photos, if you Google, early Daytona Beach racing, those Daytona 200s looked an awful lot like a Daytona Supercross now.
Yeah, you're right.
It was
it's on
rough,
the sand.
It was gnarly. They were riding big four-strokes.
Yeah.
And but that did transition to road racing. But as the whole dirt bike boom was really getting going, the late 60s, early 70s, and this was even before On Any Sunday, the movie came out, Bill West, Florida promoter, talked Mr. France and the people who were running the Speedway at the time into having an exhibition motorcycle race that was part of Daytona Bike Week. And they knew Gary Bailey. He'd been riding the Florida Winter Am Series. And mind you, the Florida Winter Am Series was the biggest motorcycle series for dirt bikes in the country at the time.
That is so bizarre.
Yep.
This is what would be considered a local regional series. But this is before there were nationals.
Before there were nationals, the Florida Winter Am Series is where people sort of gathered, especially in the East, to race each other. And you had guys like Joe Bolger, Jimmy Weinert, Tony DeStefano, or not Tony DeStefano, John DeSoto, just the guys that were the movers and shakers. Billy Clemens, visiting guys like Gunnar Lindstrom. Anyway, they decided that they were going to have a race here in the infield.
Okay.
But it was actually over where what they call Lake Lynn is now. It was held sort of over in that corner.
The backstretch, the other side.
And they in order to design some jumps, they put logs out. Gary Bailey did, and they covered them with sand, and they laid out a flat track. And again, you can Google photos. You'll see Gunnar Lindstrom. He was the winner of the 250 class that day on a Husqvarna. And then Brian Keeney was a guy from Ohio.
Okay.
He won the 500 class.
All right.
And the races were part of the Florida Winter Am Series and are mostly lost. But you can find things online, some footage of them and whatnot.
But so that counted for points in this Florida Winter Am Series, which was big at the time.
Yeah. But they also had races at Orlando Sports Stadium. They had races in Hialeah. Florida's flat. Any place where they had a car track or something, they could have an infield race. So it's kind of where it got its start.
So this Orlando thing, was that like a stadium, or was that a car track?
It was a drag
strip.
Okay. Car stadium, and they actually had a Trans Am there in 1974.
Oh, okay. So this is a weird fit. We're used to races either happening at a motocross track or a football stadium.
Right.
But back in this time, integrating some dirt bikes into a car track was actually somewhat common, or more common than we're used to now.
It was, and they did it a lot because they're the bikes were basically you'd ride your bike to the event in a lot of cases, and you'd take the license plate off, you'd switch the knobbies, and you'd go racing. But the real pushback was the people that were involved in road racing thought of motocross people as like long-haired, hippie kind of people.
Huh.
And one of them said, why are we letting all these hippies out there racing?
Really?
And, and it was in the popular cycling coverage of that first event. But the neat thing is that the people who run the Speedway and Mr. France, they liked what they saw. And by this point, Jim France, who is now the owner of AMA Pro Racing, as we know it in the Daytona Motorsports Group, was a bona fide flat track racer.
Right.
Was doing the Southeast Circuit, and flat track was really big, and that was taking place over at the high school stadium on the other side.
Which
of
one
what
is
is
that
now
called? Is that Memorial Stadium? Is that
Memorial
Municipal?
Stadium?
Memorial Stadium. Okay,
Yeah.
yes.
And that was actually the far bigger race, but they couldn't build the flat track that they wanted because the grass was too soft. The infield's too soft here, and so motocross it was, and motocross worked perfect.
So if the France family, if Jim France had what he wanted, it probably would have just been a flat track here. That's probably what he would have liked to have had.
Yeah.
It just didn't work out.
Yeah, instead they had a scrambles race.
Wow.
And now they, of course, have they're going to do next Thursday a flat track TT. They've kind of gone back to the original beginning.
Yes.
And they build it on top of, the area that right now has the Daytona Supercross on it.
Yeah, folks, if you look back at the TV coverage by the time we post this, you'll have seen the Daytona Supercross on TV. You will see on the right side of the start stretch now is dirt that is there for the flat track, which is going to take place Thursday after the Supercross. There's a flat track course built under the Supercross.
They put the foundation in before they did the Supercross track, because that way they only have a couple days, because the Daytona Amateur Supercross has grown to be so big that it takes up 3 days now. Yeah.
Now we can get into the modern interpretation of how an ATV race and an amateur race happened to come here. Maybe that's for another show. But this was really just an exhibition. Like, this wasn't expected to be a crown jewel type event in motorcycling, I guess, in 1971.
Well, again, there was no crown jewel series.
There wasn't even a series, yeah.
But you have to give Mike Goodwin credit, because the eureka moment that he had to put a race on under the lights at night, downtown Los Angeles, in the venerable Coliseum, is really what we know is the birth of Supercross. But by that point, there'd already been 2 Daytona motocross events in the infield. And that second year, they moved it over to where it is now.
Okay.
And it's remained there ever since, sometimes crossing the pavement, but not like it used to.
Okay, yeah, so take me through those early years. So somehow it went from a motocross race to a Supercross race. How did this all evolve?
Okay, it takes about 3 years.
Okay.
And what happens is AMA Motocross, as we know it, comes online in 1972.
Okay.
1972 was a big year for our sport.
Huh.
The movie On Any Sunday was up for an Academy Award. Honda had decided to build the Elsinore.
Okay.
The Pro Motocross Series started, and Mike Goodwin had his first Superbowl of Motocross. But Daytona just kept plugging along. Again, part of the Florida Winter Am Series. But because they started that National Motocross Series in 1972, Mr. France decided that he would go ahead and have the 73 race be part of it. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that the first ever AMA National in 1972 took place at Road Atlanta. It took place on the infield of Road Atlanta Speedway, or race car track, or whatever that thing is called. And it was won by Sonny DeFeo and Barry Higgins. And yes, Barry Higgins has been around that long.
Yeah. Barry Higgins was 40 years old at that point. Somehow.
He was in the back class.
Yes. So that was very similar to this, actually.
Very similar, but there was elevation changes and whatnot at Road Atlanta. It was a much different. It was more of a what we.
Oh,
consider,
because that's a road course.
It's a road
also,
course.
That's right.
It's better than the elevation changes are much different than what you would have at Daytona or Talladega or a place like that. So in '73, the Daytona event became the opening round of the 1973 AMA National Motocross Championship Series.
Wow.
And it was won, it turns out it was the first national win in the 500 class for a Yamaha. And it was Pierre Carsmakers, who had been hired to come over to shake down the new Yamaha. And at that point, it wasn't even a monoshock. That was a two-shock bike. He won, and then Bob Grossi from California won the 250 class, and they were considered national winners. By 74, the AMA is really looking at the event that Goodwin has done in the LA Coliseum and the Daytona event. Yeah. And now they've got a promoter named Alan Becker in Houston, who was the longtime promoter of the Houston Astrodome short track and TT races that actually started in 1968. And Goodwin is on record as having said that was the impetus, that was the influence that he used to put a motocross race in the LA Coliseum. Okay. It was the TT races, not the Supercross races, the TT races in the Astrodome. So the AMA decides, you know what? We're on to something here. Yeah. We need to start another series. Okay. And so in 1974, they came up with the very clunkily named AMA Yamaha Super Series of Stadium Motocross.
Jeez.
And if you look in the record books, it says now, in hindsight, 1974 AMA Supercross Championship, and the winner is Pierre Carsmakers. At that point, believe it or not, the LA Coliseum, the first true Supercross, is still not part of that series because Mike Goodwin decided that he could make more money having a standalone race, and then he decided, you know what, just to mess with the AMA, I'm going to team up with the guy the AMA doesn't like, Edison Dye, and that LA Super Bowl race becomes part of the Summer Inter-Am series.
Is this before or after Edison Dye has at this point cast the die of being like extricated?
No, that will happen in 1976.
Okay, so at this point Edison Dye is at least somewhat okay, but not great.
He's still okay.
But so, those Super Bowl motocross races were not AMA events.
They were not AMA events.
Wow.
And until 75.
Okay.
So let's look at the landscape in 1974. Yeah. You have this first series of the year, the Florida Winter Am Series.
Okay.
It's still a big, viable series. It has full factory participation.
Wow.
Team Suzuki's there, Team Yamaha's there, Kawasaki's there. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
It's bigger than the AMA Motocross Championship that takes place from April till late August.
So even though it had the tag National Championship, because the Winter Ams had been established, they were still bigger.
Yes, it was still bigger, and part of that was because the promoter of the series, Bill West, was just really good at promoting. And he would venture into Supercross promoting in the coming years and would become very successful at what he did. So anyway, you also had this Summer Inter-Am series, which was for 250cc racing, and that brought a lot of Europeans over. But because it was 250s, it was primarily Czechoslovakian and Swedish riders because they rode 250 Husqvarnas and 250 CZs. And then you had the fall Trans AMA series, or the Trans Ams. Yep. And that event got a lot of German and Belgian riders because they rode 500s primarily. So that's where you got Adolf Wheel, Roger DeCoster, Pierre Carsmakers, Heikki Mikkola, all these people. So you had all these competing series, and 74 is really the busiest year on the calendar.
That's the year where you have the Nationals have begun, Florida Winter Series is still good, Trans Ams and Inter-Ams are also popular.
And you have this fledgling AMA Yamaha Super Series of Stadium Motocross.
Which is only Daytona and Houston?
It's only Daytona and Houston, and at that point, those events are on back-to-back weekends. So you raced on Saturday at Daytona, 2 classes, 250 and 500.
Okay.
Believe it or not, 4 motos. It was a 4-moto affair.
The riders would race both classes?
No, they would not race both classes.
It was 4 motos in each class?
It was 4 motos, and you know what? Let me check.
Okay.
Let's get back to that.
Okay.
Houston is the following weekend.
All right.
Houston takes place on Friday night and Saturday. Houston has 2 motos on Friday night, 2 motos on Saturday.
Wow.
Back up, Daytona was a 3-moto format. My bad.
Okay. All right.
So your entire AMA Yamaha Super Series of Motocross consists of literally 7 main events that take place over the course of one Saturday in Florida, followed the next weekend by a Friday and Saturday in Houston. And that's it. That's the end of the series.
On the 8th day, the series is complete.
Yes. And then way down, in July, you have the Superbowl of Motocross that's part of another series altogether. So the winners...
Edison Dies series.
Which
is called what?
It was the Interim.
Oh, that's the Interim. Okay.
And had the LA Super Bowl. Okay, so Pierre Carsmakers comes back, and this time he rides the 250 class, and he wins. The winner of the first 500cc Daytona Supercross, because now we can use that word even though it's not been invented yet, is Roger DeCoster.
Wow.
The man.
Wow.
The man.
Okay.
He literally goes back to day one of this.
Yes. The first time it was ever part of the series that it's a part of now, he wins. And that 250-500 thing, was that just like we're going to – there wasn't a premier class. They just did it.
There was not a premier class at that time. They split the talent.
Yeah.
So you had guys like Rex Staten, Tony DeStefano, Steve Stackable riding the 500 class, and then you had guys like Pierre Carsmakers, Gary Jones, Jim Pomeroy, Jimmy Ellis riding the 250 class.
Yeah.
They would not consolidate that until 1976.
Okay.
But I'm getting ahead of myself because something happens here in 1975 that no one understands how it's going to change everything.
Let's end with 74. So 74, all it is just the Houston and Daytona events. That's your championship.
Yep.
So let's roll into 75. What becomes the landscape the next year?
The next year, there is going to be a Dallas race added.
Okay.
And now
Becker also?
They're finally going to incorporate the LA Super Bowl race because the Interim series is dying at this point.
Okay.
And the reason it's dying is because people like this shiny new thing over here a little better.
Yeah.
And that thing is this Stadium Motocross series. And Edison Dye, who his real job, he was the importer for Husqvarna motorcycles. Mm-hmm. He's lost that gig, and now he's trying to import Rebel motorcycles, his own brand, and that's not going so well. So Edison Dye is about to sort of fall off of the radar of everyone, and then he will make a catastrophic blunder in an event he's promoting in 1976 where he decides to cancel after qualifying because it's so muddy and no spectators are coming, and he withholds the purse money. And because of that, the riders all boycott Edison Dye events. He's basically run into history's dustbin as far as motocross goes, and it won't be till years and years later that people realize just how influential and important he was, and he gets into the Hall of Fame and is now regarded as the pioneer that he was. But for a while there, he was the guy in the black hat.
Well, in a nutshell, Edison Dye is one that had this vision of, if we bring Europeans and European-style racing to the United States, it's going to explode.
Yes.
That was his vision.
Yes.
Which led us to really where we are today.
Yes.
But it's funny how history works. It takes a long time sometimes for people to realize
until the homegrown talent got to the same level the Europeans were, that's what you had to do.
All right, so 75. What's the 75 landscape? We have Dallas now.
You start in Daytona.
Yep.
You go to Dallas and you have Houston, and then you end with the LA Super Bowl. So now it's ostensibly 4 rounds, but there's multiple parts of each round, in that there's still 3 motos, 2 motos, and even 3 motos at the LA Coliseum.
Okay.
And ironically, all 4 races, the first ever perfect series, and the only one in Supercross history, happens in 1975.
Okay.
Jimmy Ellis, riding a Can-Am, a bike made in Canada, wins Daytona in the 250 class, Dallas and Houston, and the LA Super Bowl of Motocross. And we kind of forget about that there was a perfect season. But the thing is,
4 rounds.
It was 4 races.
Yeah.
So, now we get that often in succession in the middle of a series.
Can-Am had a very brief run. That wasn't like a shock. Like, the bike was at that,
it was a good
time
bike.
considered
It was
legit.
a good bike, yeah.
Yes.
But the thing that happens, though, the real game changer, happens far off what you would call anyone's landscape, anyone's radar.
All right.
There is a guy in Ohio who works at the AMA, and he decides that he's going to make a yearbook, a record book, so to speak. And what he wants to do is he wants to recap all of AMA racing for 1974, and he wants to bring it to Daytona and sell it as sort of an event program in the concession stands and whatnot.
Right.
In the book, in the description of the AMA Yamaha Super Series of Motocross, he decides to shorten it and just says Supercross. And the way he says it is, Mike Goodwin might be famous for having the Rolling Stones in Shea Stadium in New York, or he might be famous for these desert races he did, but he may go down in history as the guy who invented Supercross. When I pointed this out to the guy a couple years ago, that he was the one who coined the phrase Supercross, he got a big kick out of it.
But he wasn't aware of it.
He was not aware of it.
He was not aware that he actually was the first person to put that term in print.
And he's not in the Hall of Fame for coming up with that term. He's in the Hall of Fame for all the other things he did. And that guy is Dave Despain, who everyone listening to this would know his voice, know his influence, but probably doesn't realize that Dave Despain is the guy who first used the word Supercross in referral to stadium motocross events. And from that moment on, we had a separation of church and state, as it were, or in this case, day and night. If a race took place at night, it was a Supercross. If a race took place during the day, it was a motocross.
So literally inventing that term really helped to clarify in more ways than one, not just how to describe it, but then the entire course of there was such alphabet soup the year before.
There was
5 or 6 series.
There was, and there's also some sort of decimation and attrition happening in that the Inter-Am series goes away, and in the course of the next 6 years, the Trans Am series is going to go away.
Right.
And the reason it's going to go away is because this Supercross thing has legs.
Yeah.
And at first, it's just Daytona and Mike Goodwin involved and Alan Becker.
Yeah.
And Alan Becker has a company called Pace Motorsports in Houston, and it later becomes Pace SRO, and it later becomes SFX, and it later becomes all these things. And it is now, for all intents and purposes, what we now know as Feld Motorsports.
Yep.
The Beckers are no longer involved, but their company is the one that Kenneth Feld bought in 2008. But it goes back to that the Houston races, the TT races that really outdate everything when you look at it. But the made up of Daytona, the Houston Astrodome, Texas Stadium in Irvine, and Mike Goodwin's LA Super Bowl. So those races will grow pretty soon. Bill West is going to start having races with Goodwin in Atlanta, and pretty soon Jim France is going to have races in Talladega on the infield. And pretty soon Mike Goodwin is going to move up the coast, or down the coast, I should say, to San Diego, Anaheim. And by 1980, you have 12, 14-round Supercross series that takes place. It takes up much of the calendar year. And those are tough races to do. And what will happen there is the OEMs will get together and say, we're not going to do Trans Am races anymore. We get more people, more television coverage, more media when we go race downtown than we do racing the same tracks that hold national motocross events. And by this point, the Americans are winning. The Europeans quit coming. And really the last guy out the door is Roger DeCoster as far as foreign riders doing the Trans AMA series. In 1982, the very last Trans AMA happens. It's actually called a Trans USA by this point. And I can't tell you.
Did they get in trouble with Pontiac?
They did get in trouble.
That?
They got sued. They lost calling it Trans Am, Trans AMA.
Was it because the car was Trans Am?
Yeah, because the car. And the last Trans Am champion is Dave Hollis from Michigan, and the last Trans Am race is held at Redbud.
No way.
Redbud held on.
Wow. So the series is a shell of itself by 82.
Yes.
But the sea change had been 5-6 years before that.
Yeah.
It was already, the process was in motion.
The things that were happening is because of the dirt bike boom in America in the early 70s, we have homegrown talent. Bob Hanna is a bigger star than Garrett Wolsink. Marty Smith is just as big of a star as Roger DeCoster.
Right.
And they want to race in stadiums. They don't want to, keep going to the same outdoor tracks and do, because it was sort of redundant. So those series go away, and sadly, the other casualty of the success of Supercross, and specifically the success of a new Supercross promoter, Bill West, the other casualty will be the Florida Winter Am Series.
Which is what Daytona started at.
It is at its peak in 1976. You literally have every factory team there getting ready for the start of the Supercross season, which is at Daytona. So any Florida Winter Am in 1976 had Danny Laporte, Bob Hanna, Rick Burgett, Steve Stackable, Tony DiStefano, Team Honda. It was unbelievable, the lineup that they had.
Yeah.
And because Supercross would continue growing and begin to really tax the budgets of the factory teams as well as the riders.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, man, by the early 80s, they're doing 18 Supercross races and 13 Nationals. Something had to give, and that thing that gave was the one that started it all, the Florida Winter Am Series.
Is it not amazing how history repeats itself? Because here we are, the last 2 or 3 years of, man, with 17 Supercrosses and 12 Nationals, our riders really can't do much more than this. It's the same argument that you're saying has been happening since 1980, 1982. Yes.
Yeah, but what else has changed is because there are more sponsors involved, there's more demands on the athletes, there's more expected of the athletes, and
today,
also,
yes.
The whole game has changed on how much the athletes train.
Right.
It really was just a fun deal. The guys in Florida training in the mid-'70s, I don't know that they were training the whole time they were here.
Okay, yeah, it wasn't Alden Baker's
But
program.
they did get serious once Daytona started. Daytona was the real kickoff, and I think that the France family really liked that because it was also the kickoff of NASCAR. When you think about it, for a while there they had a lock on the first big NASCAR race was Daytona. The first big motocross race was Daytona.
Aha. Okay, so when does that actually change? As Anaheim starts to – because Anaheim started in November at one point, right?
Anaheim was a November race. The first Anaheim wasn't even an AMA race. And Marty Smith signed up for it on a 125 because it was just a run what you brung race that took place in December, and it was called the U.S. Open of Motocross. The American Motocross Finals and the U.S. Open of Motocross.
Another example of how there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah, and finally Goodwin just made it part of the series.
Okay. So the idea that Supercross starts in January had not rooted until a little bit later.
Yeah, would not that it would start in March. I'm going to guess probably up until 1982 or
go
so.
Through the book here. Dave Despain, good job. Now we have real record books we could look through here.
Yeah. I can tell you that it was. I take it back. 1977, Atlanta in Fulton County Stadium was the week before Daytona Beach. So from 71 to 76, it was the first race.
Yep.
But it was always the anchor for here, and it's the only event that has remained on the AMA Supercross calendar from the get-go, from day one.
That's right.
Anaheim's come and gone. The LA Coliseum's come and gone. The Houston Astrodome is no longer there. The Houston venue would come and go.
Yep.
But that first year, there's only two, Houston and Daytona.
Yeah.
Daytona's the granddaddy of them all.
What made them decide, you know what, let's move Daytona to this Stadium Motocross Series and take it out of the National Motocross Series?
I think the person you have to give credit to at that point was Mr. France.
Yeah.
I think Bill France, back in 74, thought that he could expand this thing, and there were purists out there who just didn't see it as a motocross race. They wanted to get something going that they could have on their own that wouldn't be run by a sanctioning body, which the AMA Motocross Series was until 2008. When you really think about it.
Yep.
They wanted to build on their success by having sponsors, and they did. They had sponsors like Pennzoil and Olympia Beer, and believe it or not, Nissan was an early sponsor, and Datsun, which was pre-Nissan.
Pre-Nissan, yeah.
Yeah.
And even up until this year, even the Honda sponsorship, it was the only event that had that. It was the Daytona Supercross by Honda. Now this year they've integrated him, and they are now Monster, but they had their own unique sponsorship up until tomorrow, basically.
Yeah. And so a lot of things will happen to make sort of Daytona stand out. And one of the big things is people don't realize that we always talk about how Wide World of Sports covered the USGP at Carlsbad, and that was it.
Yeah.
That's not technically true.
Okay.
You can go back and find on the CBS Sports Spectacular right now, Google 1979 Daytona Supercross, and they had the full-blown TV crew here and did an hour-long coverage of that event, and it would build over the years, and sometimes it's hit or miss, but by 1985, 1986, every year there was a home for the Daytona Supercross on TV.
Oh.
And part of that was because it was so easy to film compared to some of the other things going on because the Daytona people, IOC, or International, what is it? ISC. I'm sorry,
Speedway
ISC
Corporation
has had their own production facilities, and it was easy to film this race. And but Supercross really hit its speed in the early 80s and really began to sort of overwhelm the sport, as it were.
Yeah.
And they were able to push all of the nationals basically back in the calendar year, even though there were some overlap.
Yep.
And Daytona really didn't have anything to do with that because Daytona was now fully a part of the Supercross schedule.
Yep.
But what happened was the man who lost the Florida Winter Am Series, Bill West, had this other event, Gatorback. Yes. He had the Gatorback National, and beginning in 1983, he had enough juice to say that National is going to take place the week before the Daytona Supercross, and they made room for it. And suddenly you had Nationals starting in February and ending all the way in October at times.
Yeah.
It was an untenable schedule, but in the middle of those 14 Nationals, you also had 18 Supercrosses. It was crazy.
Yeah, it's fairly recent history. We all are used to now Supercross ends and the Nationals begin, but it wasn't that long ago where 2 or 3 rounds would overlap. Wouldn't they even race high points sometimes before Supercross was even done?
Oh, Robbie Reynard did his first Pro National, 1993, High Point Raceway, and then the next week breaks his wrist at San Jose at the Supercross.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, the person who should get credit for fighting that overlap, Jody Weisel.
The Orphan National.
The Orphan National. You remember it as well as I do.
The pen was very heavy.
Yeah, but the OEMs are starting to voice their concerns to the AMA, saying, look, Supercross has become so specialized. We're using different bikes.
Yeah.
We're doing things differently. It doesn't make sense to run 2 series concurrently, sanctioned by the same entity, using the same athletes, because if you get hurt in one, you get knocked out of the other. We need to have some separation. And they began to separate sort of organically, except for Gatorback. And Bill West held the line until 1997. And that would have sort of a serendipitous nature to it as well, because 1997 was the year a product of Gatorback. A local boy got to ride that national, and he won it. And it was the first national he ever won, Ricky Carmichael. And the beginning of the Ricky Carmichael era was the end of the Orphan National.
So in 97, that was the last Gatorback?
That was the last Gatorback National.
Now, at the time, it made, from reading MXA every year, you're like, this race has to move, it has to go. But what I didn't realize is they didn't just take Gatorback away from Bill West. They just essentially moved it into becoming the Tampa Supercross.
Bill West took his date, the pressure, and Bill was a smart man.
Yeah.
But he had a good thing going, but then he realized he could have a better thing going if he took the Gatorback National and moved it to Tampa.
Yep.
And that became the Tampa Supercross. And by this time, Bill was almost an equal partner in Supercross. The one person in all of this, whether it's Alan Becker, Mike Goodwin, the Thompson group that would come along, Charlie Mancuso at some point, the one person that didn't expand anything other than once, Talladega in 1984, was the France family. They said, you know what? We're really in the car business. We have Bike Week, and that's it. We're going to stick with this one bike week, this one bike Supercross, and it's going to be Daytona. And they left it alone. They didn't put one into Fontana. They didn't put one into. I mean, other promoters tried other things.
Yeah.
Other promoters put events in Pocono, Road Atlanta, as I mentioned before. Sears Point, Fontana, Ontario had a race at one point, but even Joliet in 2000, the drag strip.
Yes.
But the France people and ISC decided that they were going to just stick with this one race, and so Daytona didn't change for a real long time. When you think about it, and you can go back and watch that old footage, and again, go look at the 1979 Daytona Supercross, and then Google the 1986 Daytona Supercross.
Yeah.
You won't see a lot of evolution.
Well, there's so much talk about when they went over the wall and those log jumps with sand, but that was relatively brief. The majority of Daytona history was the way we're used to seeing it.
No, that's the Daytona history as far as the track build goes. There are two things that are going to affect that.
Okay.
Number one, Gary Bailey was the track builder. Gary Bailey came up with the ideas of things like laying down telephone poles and covering them with sand, and those were the whoops. And doing the gator pits where you dig out a hole after a jump and you'd have to ride over the wall, then down into the hole. And what would change that is Johnny O'Mara in 1984 going for the finish line jump, trying to pass Rick Johnson for second. He would just go for broke, wide open, launch it, jump the whole thing, and land, and lo and behold, nothing happened. He didn't shatter. His bike didn't break in half. And all of a sudden, the next year, everyone's jumping the gator pits, and it antiquated what Bailey was doing. Bailey would continue to build the track, and then he was fired. He had a run-in with local authorities maybe a dozen years ago. They would turn the track building duties over to Mark Barnett. And Barnett was 1981 Supercross champion. A past Daytona winner. He was more in touch with what everyone wanted. And but right at that same time as that transition was happening, the AMA asked Daytona to consider bringing in Moscow lights and turning the Daytona daytime Supercross race into a nighttime race. And I believe the first year that happened was 2005.
And I know there's a lot of nostalgia for the old, even though it was Supercross, it felt more like a national Daytona where they had a bigger field and it was a long race run during the day in the heat and the sunshine. But you cannot argue that this race is a lot more popular. And how many fans are here since they moved it to the nighttime? Now they let the fans stand on the actual high banks and get right up close to the track. To me, the crowd was always okay, but not as good as a regular Supercross. But now this race is a booming hit now that they moved it to the nighttime.
It is a booming hit, but and I believe it was John Ferris and Scott Hollinsworth with the driving forces in 04, 05 into sort of moving this event, the oldest event, from how it started and what it looked like, because it changed very little to what it is now. But the other thing that changes is a recession comes along. And what was once an incredible week where the Daytona 200 dwarfed the Supercross, all of a sudden the hardest hit segment of racing and motorsports as far as the motorcycle industry goes is superbike racing. And the Daytona 200 loses its luster. Fortunately, Supercross didn't really feel the recession, neither did motocross, because the price of racing and getting involved in the sport in the first place, to buy a mini bike, to buy a 250, a 450, or whatever, was nothing compared to what it was to go superbike racing. And so Bike Week suffered. The amount of people riding Harleys went down. The road racing that used to last a week suddenly, got down to where it was like just 3 or 4 days, and the Supercross kept chugging along. And at that point, they decided, you know what? Let's make a big change. Let's move the Supercross to the front of the week. Let's have a Supercross race. Let's start out on a high note, and then let's get all the dirt out and then focus on the road race. Because back in the day, what people didn't realize is when they would cross the track and do all those things, man, they'd be out there all night long trying to get the dirt and dusting off the pavement, and it became untenable because the road bikes got faster and faster to the point where just a little bit of dust was really problematic.
So that's what actually led to, I hear about them going over the wall and everything. That's actually what led to taking that away.
Well, there was also the evolution of what the spectators wanted. I'll give you an example. The first pro professional race we did at Steel City in 1987, the 125 GP. The lap times were 3 minutes and 13 seconds. Because my dad thought, I'm going to put a GP track on, and he ran it over this hill and down into those woods and here and there and whatever.
Yeah.
And the problem was, it was great, but it was impossible to water. It was impossible to televise. No one got to see the riders very much.
Yeah.
And so it was like, man, that didn't work. We need a 2-minute lap time.
I see.
Well, Daytona had this really long lap time going out over the wall and all that stuff like that. But it was a lot of extra work, and it was taking the riders away from the fans.
Yep.
It was like the people want to see the athletes, and we want to be able to have a safe race where we can see if a guy goes down. We can see what's going on. So they brought it in and made it more like a traditional Supercross, and I think it's been a success. They also brought in a lot more dirt. That was one of the things that Gary Bailey did not have the luxury of, that Barnett and then later Ricky Carmichael, after he retires, would have the luxury of, and that is they let him dig into the ground, and they also let him go get dirt and haul it in.
Yeah.
And Gary made do with what he could make do with.
Right.
And that was sometimes using a flatbed semi-truck and throwing dirt over it because he didn't have enough dirt otherwise.
Telephone poles.
Telephone poles. And, I raced the 85 Daytona Supercross, and as much fun as it may have looked to people to see us bouncing over those telephone pole whoops or jumping those limestone tabletops and doubles and things like that, man, it sucked. It was a hard day of work. And I just in Racerhead recently, Jason Thomas was writing about the 97 Daytona Supercross when they ran, across the pavement and did all these things, and they ran 20 laps, and that turned into a 35-minute race, and he said it was the gnarliest thing he ever did.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because today on the RacerX site for This Day in Motocross, you wrote about the 1985 event, which is the last Supercross Bob Hanna won. 12 laps. It's a 12-lap main event, but I'm assuming that's because the lap time was so long.
Oh, yeah.
That was still a really long race.
When they say going over the walls, they're not talking about going out of the facility. They're talking about going into the real infield, the infield over here where you would be behind the pits. You would go through fences that were open. You would go down the lane that you leave when you're leaving pit row.
Wow.
And it was a really complicated
all
race.
Dirt, or would they be on pavement?
They'd be on pavement. Again, Google the 1979 Daytona Supercross and just be ready to have your jaw hit your computer.
Were they on pavement by design, or did they have dirt and they got to the bottom of that dirt? Or were there parts that just
by design.
never even had
in
dirt
the early
on them?
In the early years, it was by design.
They didn't even put dirt on parts.
They didn't even put dirt on it.
Like
later they would put dirt on the crossings,
yeah.
but then after a while, it was like, why are we doing these crossings?
Yeah.
It was like, why don't we just all do it here?
Yes.
And it got there, but it wasn't for a while. And if you go back and look at those 80s Daytona Supercross races, and I'm talking about, you mentioned the one that Hanna won in 85. 86 was RJ versus David Bailey. 87 was just crazy because that was the year that it rained and rained and rained. Just like, you would equate it to Hangtown in 1991, where they put off all of the qualifying. They waited until 3 o'clock in the afternoon to give Bailey a chance to drain as much of the track as he could before they even started the race. Problem is, there was no lights back then, so they had to hustle through it.
Yeah.
And all four of the OEMs, according to the Cycle News reporter that day, Kit Palmer, all four of the OEMs had said that they wanted the race canceled or postponed. But they had, enough people here where they're like, well, let's just have a race and see how it works out.
That 87 race.
That 87 race.
Watch the video. It doesn't look that. It was that bad.
It was that bad early in the day.
Wow.
And they had to drain everything. But this is Florida. Everything soaks up.
Yeah.
But the thing is, they didn't know that it was going to stop raining. Well, the bottom falls out of the track. People are getting stuck everywhere. Bailey has to reroute it everywhere. But they finally decide that they don't even have time to have an LCQ. They're just going to put 40 guys out there. So the main event, double row start, 40 guys, and right off the start, some of the big names like Johnson and Ward and Lachine all crash, and then suddenly you have guys that shouldn't really be up there, like a young Jeff Stanton, who's riding a Yamaha at the time, George Holland, who was a 125 specialist, and Keith Bowen, who was a decent Yamaha guy, but at that point he was already kind of losing his upward momentum.
Yes.
And a California privateer on a CR250 named Ricky Ryan. And Ricky Ryan, who knew he was a mud rider? I don't think he knew he was a mud rider.
Yeah,
but he just kept on trucking, on trucking. And when
that was Bowen's race to win.
Bowen's race to win, and he got, of all things, a rock caught between his countershaft sprocket and his engine / swing arm, and his bike was completely, it just stopped. And that was 2 laps from the finish. And it would have been Keith Bowen's one and only Supercross win.
Yep.
As it turned out, instead, it is the one and only Supercross win by a true privateer.
Yes.
And what's funny is, just like what would happen in Hangtown in 1991, when all the teams wanted the race thrown out, 2 privateers, Doug Henry and John Dowd, went out and won the motos, and it remains the only privateer national win ever. But if you think that Ricky Ryan's win was a complete, absolute outlier or sheer luck, the week before at the Gatorback National, riding a CR 125, Rick Ryan won the first moto.
So he was on a roll.
Yeah.
Well, we have to qualify for these millennials listening to this. Yes, Rick Ryan was a privateer, but I believe he was like national number 10.
Number 12.
In those, he earned 10 the next year. So he was 12, and then he was a top 10 guy. Nowadays, you're a factory rider for years.
You're a factory rider when your parents name you Ryder.
Yeah, you're a factory rider when you're named Ryder. Yes, he wasn't a guy who was barely making mains. He was a solid rider. Right, but back then there weren't as many factory rides to go around.
Yeah. No, but actually there were like 3 or 4 factory guys per team. And they were all riding in the 250 class. Yeah. So it was just the real anomaly was that all 3 members of Team Honda, David Bailey, Johnny O'Mara, and Rick Johnson, would have problems in that race. Oh, and Mickey Diamond would have problems in that race. Brock Glover was hurt. Keith Bowen got a rock stuck in his bike. Yeah. Doug Dubach was at, there was a bunch of guys out there. Just everyone had a bad day except for Ricky Ryan.
It was so good they referenced it in Supercross the movie even. A privateer can do this. Ricky Ryan got mentioned in a movie 20 years later as the only privateer to ever win. True privateer. I know Chad Reed had his own team. Trust me, I'm sure it was a better setup than what Ricky Ryan had in 1987. What is also interesting in the history to show how unique this race is, then it entered into this run of eras. Then Jeff Stanton just started winning it every year. Then Mike Kudrowski just started winning it every year. It was just, guys could be having a terrible season, but if they were a Daytona guy, they could come to Daytona and completely right the ship for one weekend.
Yeah, they could, but think about the guys who never won here.
Yeah.
Darrell Schultz, Bob Hanna, those guys would win multiple years. You had to be a hard man back then. You had to be Rocket Rex Satan. You had to be the Jammer.
Yeah.
You had to be Ricky Johnson or David Bailey.
Or Stanton and Kudrowski were known as those kinds of guys.
But Jeff Ward was one of those guys, and he never won it. Gary Jones, Danny Laporte. There was a lot of really good guys who just it never came right for them. But strangely, beginning with Stanton, it would seem like there would be guys who'd win it multiple times at a time.
Stanton, you would just run.
Stanton had his 4-year run. Then Kudrowski had a 3-year run.
Yeah.
And then everyone forgets that Jeremy McGrath won it 3 out of 4 years, and probably would have had a couple others here and there if not for little things happening to him. Jeremy always, I remember when he first came on the scene in '93, we all thought he was a Supercross specialist. Even he thought he was a Supercross specialist. He was not. He was really, really good at motocross. He just knew that, the career that he wanted to have and the longevity that he wanted to have, if he focused on Supercross, which he did entirely after 1998, he would win more championships than anyone, and he still has more championships than anyone. But then, the Ricky era came along. Chad Reed is really good at this track. You still have hiccups like, Kevin Windham, can win in a mutter.
The other mud race.
Yeah.
The 2008 mutter. It almost reminded me of when, say, the Unadilla USGP or Carlsbad USGP. This is not a standalone event like that was, as far as that was the only race the Americans raced in that series. But DeCoster never won Carlsbad, right?
Nope.
And Hanna was so good at Unadilla, but it took him forever to get it.
It took a gift. When O'Mara ran out of gas.
Right.
Brad Lackey never won the USGP. And they were the guys ostensibly that the show was made for.
Yeah.
From 1973 to 1982. They never won, and Garrett Wolsink, who won a total of 12 races in his entire career, 5 of them were Carlsbad.
These standalone type races, I guess I should say unique type of races, they end up generating these unique results where you have these guys. You can't even say they're specialists because, like you said, Jeff Ward would be just as good at this track as anybody else. He just didn't happen to win it. They almost had favored sons. Riders the track liked, and riders the moto gods were not going to treat the right way.
And in that regard, Daytona is the Southwick of Supercross.
Yeah, totally unique as far as the results go. Okay, so now we come here today, and it's been homogenized in a way. It's more like a regular Supercross as far as the lap time distance, the type of obstacles, racing on Saturday night. It's more like a regular Supercross than it once was, but it is still its own animal in its own way. It's not the riding over the walls and 3-minute lap time on pavement, but it's still its own unique thing.
Yeah, it's a motocross race with on steroids when you look at the jumps. But it's more of a motocross than a supercross. It'll start out as a supercross because of the fact they're allowed to bring in all this clay to build the jumps, the configuration that Ricky and Mark Barnett have come up with. But as the racing gets underway and the traffic starts happening, the ruts will start to form. It'll become an entirely different animal than what they'll see. You know, the Fulton County race used to be like that in Atlanta because the dirt was at the mercy of the weather.
Yeah.
And if it were cold in Atlanta and the dew would set in, it would change everything. And that's why we had some incredible races. We also had some incredible mudders in Atlanta. Well, Daytona has run the gamut of everything. It was here when guys were riding Triumphs, BSAs, Makos, Rickmans, AJSs. It was here when the Japanese wave came and the only European bikes out there were Makos, CZs, and Husqvarnas. Then it was nothing, but Japanese bikes. And now, we've gone from, 2 strokes to 4 strokes and KTM and Husqvarna are back, and Daytona will be here forever.
Yeah, it's one of the least.
It's not going
changed.
anywhere.
One other topic I want to hit on. You mentioned you raced this as a pro. Did you do amateur here ever?
I did the amateur. And what happened was Daytona had amateur races as part of the Florida Winter Am Series.
Okay.
You still, Bill West still had the tie-in.
Yeah.
Where the last round of the Florida Winter Am was here, and to qualify, you had to do the Florida Winter Am.
Okay.
So that meant driving back and forth from West Virginia to Cocoa Beach and Jacksonville and St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
A few times in order to get the chance to race Daytona.
Wow.
Even though you were racing an RM100 painted green because you were on Team Green, and they didn't make a 100.
Okay.
But in 1985 when they decided to start a 125 Supercross class, that was the one year that I raced Supercross. So I got to be part of the whole big shooting match, so to speak, and it was a day and night difference from what we had on amateur day. And there still was an amateur day right up until I want to say the early 90s. I know Ricky rode the amateur day here on a 60 at one point.
Yeah, he was kind of lamenting that went away, and then it came all the way back. The grand point that I'm getting to here is if you're a rider from the Northeast, like you were and many are, what is March and spring break and getting down here? You had Gator back, you had a GNCC, you have this. To get out of that cold weather and finally be able to freaking ride your dirt bike. What was that whole experience like back then?
It was exactly the way you described it.
Yeah.
It was, you look forward to it all, winter long, because the last race you would do would be the Mini O's, which were at that time over in Homosassa Springs at a track, believe it or not, called Chicken Farm. You would go do that, and then it moved to Ocala, and then it ended up at Gainesville. And then there was nothing. You might do the Harrisburg Motorama Arena Cross or maybe one of Drew Wolf's races over in Ohio. But all you wanted to do was get down here. If you weren't doing the Florida Winter Ams, which someone like Barry Karsten could tell you, was a huge part of the fabric of his life. And I remember, every year John Dowd was down here. Bowen was down here. Gene Newmack was actually from Massachusetts.
Doug Henry, I'm sure.
Doug Henry. Yep. Just so many people that you had all those great memories with. And then it kind of died out because what happened was you kind of skipped the Florida Winter Ams because you were doing Supercross. You're getting ready for that.
Yeah.
And the idea of these GPFs and south of the border and all those practice facilities that didn't exist.
Yeah.
You just went right into it. But there was still the Gatorback National, Amateur Day at Gatorback, and then the midweek GNCC, and then the midweek Daytona Amateur Supercross, and it was a big deal because there was no internet, there was no cell phones, there was no computer. You hung out together, you rode together, you hung out after you rode together, you camped together, and I like to think that the vibe of us sitting here on this infield, in between motorhomes and all these pit bikes buzzing by, and that's the way it was back then.
Yeah.
And in that regard, I think Daytona is still a throwback, especially since the Speedway relented and allowed Ricky and us to get together and bring amateur Supercross racing back. And it really, I think, helped this event become its own destination more so than it ever was, because I know there's other amateur Supercross races now, and they look like they're doing pretty well, but there's a different vibe here because we're sitting next to Eli Tomac's motorhome, and he's playing horseshoes behind us. He's racing tomorrow, and that's awesome.
Yeah.
But all these other people, they're racing on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and they probably don't realize that he's right there.
Right there.
Again, that's part of the unique nature of this event. The fact that the tradition of the original, that racing over the logs back in 1971 on the infield at Daytona, just people hanging out, having a dirt bike race, it stayed true to that. It's still here. It probably the same security guards because they look like they've been here from day one.
They're Barry Higgins level.
But the facility has become a destination, and that it is different than the rest of Monster Energy Supercross. It's unique. It's fun. I doubt anyone would want to have 17 of these, and I doubt 17 of these would be successful. But this one, it's really successful. And I don't know that you could pull this off anywhere else.
Indeed, that's true. Just think about this. There have been many hybrid-type dirt bike races, but they almost always end up being a weaker form of Supercross and motocross combined. Whereas for some reason, Daytona is known as the toughest and the most prestigious, and as you now know, certainly the most historic race of dirt bikes anywhere. Hope you enjoyed that trip down memory lane, be it a 2.5-mile NASCAR Super Speedway lane. With Davey Coombs, and this is just the start of the RacerX Exhaust Podcast, brought to you by Yoshimura, the leader in four-stroke performance for over 63 years. With unsurpassed quality, service, and development, Yoshimura is the brand you want for your dirt bike, ATV, or street exhaust. Check them out at yoshimura-rd.com. Thanks to those guys for being visionaries, and we'll be back next week with more from right down here in Daytona. Subscribe on iTunes and every other place you get your podcast. Heck, we're even posting these on YouTube so you can soak up all the data you possibly can watching a video that has nothing but a logo and audio. Do it that way if you'd like. Either way, we'll be back next week. Thanks for listening to RacerX Exhaust by Yoshimura.